Hey, everybody. Lieutenant Joe Pangaro here for the Blue Heart Podcast and today's episode of Murder and Mayhem with Lieutenant Joe
I'm Marisa Joy.
and Marisa Joy. All right, so let's start out. First of all, let's go over here. Our sponsors, the Blue Heart Podcast, is sponsored by Blue 360 Media. They're my publishers. Riot Tint behind the lovely Marisa Joy. All right. And medicalessentialdiagnostics.com. They help you get a screening if you're a first responder in the state of New Jersey. You and your family members can keep you healthy. All right. So, murder and mayhem. We did our first episode, and I got a lot of feedback from people who thought it was pretty cool. Most people really just like Marisa Joy. Okay. Fair enough. She's a very talented young woman. She's not just a beautiful face; she's really a beautiful, brilliant mind.
A
And
beautiful mind.
she's beautiful mind. And she has a penchant to enjoy true crime, don't you?
Yeah, since I was in sixth grade, I started learning about all the cases. I know about all of them. I've watched the full trials very often because they're always available. So I'm pretty well in depth with the case we're going to talk about today, too.
Excellent. So we're just enjoying our adult beverage.
Hmm.
We're relaxing. And we're going to talk today about a case that has come back to us from 1989, and it's now in the news again. So one of the things we like to do here is keep it topical. So we're talking about the Menendez brothers. All
Hmm.
right, we got the two brothers, Lyle and Eric, who were arrested in
Hmm.
1989 for the brutal shotgun slayings of their parents, their mom and their dad.
Yeah.
So, Marisa,
Jose and Kitty.
what is it that you, as a young person, know about the Menendez story? Not necessarily about the brothers, but the story.
Yeah, so I know when everything was happening, I obviously was too young and my generation wasn't there for the initial craziness of it all. But what's very interesting is my generation and the young people on Instagram, TikTok, everyone who learned about the case, making it so topical. That's why we're talking about it today, is like the resurgence of interest in the case that has happened over the past 5 years. So hearing about it growing up, you hear the Menendez brothers, but really seeing it contextualized in the past couple years with the new documentary, with the Netflix fictionalized show, it's given a completely different perspective, I think, to the case, while also giving the world has a different perspective now on how we view cases like that.
Yes.
So,
And I think that's the part for you, the law enforcement audience out there, is to understand how. Now, we're not talking ancient history here.
mhm,
We're talking 1989, 1990. This was, what, 35 years ago? We're not talking hundreds of years ago. This was within our timelines. All
mhm,
right. 1989, I had just been on the job a couple of years. This case came out in contemporary time to the O.J. Simpson murder case. So they kind of overshadowed each other. They were both in Los Angeles, both really big deal cases.
mhm.
But if we know what we do know about Lyle and Eric Menendez and Jose and Kitty's, the mother and father. Jose was a young man who came to this country. His family came from Cuba. He worked his way up. He ended up as a movie mogul working in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And he was a producer, I think, and he
Mhm.
was involved in all
Music,
kinds of
movies.
movies. Movies you would know,
Yeah.
even big movies. He was a beautiful career the guy had. His wife was a beauty pageant person early on in her life. And they got together and they had these two boys and they had lived in a mansion
Yeah.
in Beverly Hills. Absolutely beautiful life. And then one day, in the midst of this beautiful life, the
Mm.
police get a report from the two boys calling the police headquarters saying, somebody killed my parents.
In hysterics, not just calling,
Right.
in these hysterics. Yeah.
That they came home and they found mom and dad dead. Okay, pretty hysterical thing. The police send out all the troops out here. Now you got to figure Hollywood, Beverly Hills is a very, very high-end community. Lots and lots of money. The rich Hollywood stars and producers all live there. For a homicide to be there in such close proximity to the OJ murder,
Yeah.
they had to be really, I can imagine that they were on edge with all of this,
Yeah.
what's going on here. So they come out there and they find Jose and Kitty Menendez had been shotgunned to death in their living room while they were watching TV.
And eating ice cream.
Eating ice cream.
But I think that's just such a good symbol for how like their guards were so down. And it's such like an innocent eating ice cream in your, living room. How
Right.
could you get more innocent at the time?
And good point, because when we look at what the charges were and what the boys eventually said, what do I say all the time? Previous incidents, let the crime scene talk to you. All right. So what we're looking at here, that crime scene, just what Marisa's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Mom and Dad, the TV was on when the cops came in.
Mm-hmm.
They were watching TV, sitting on the couch, eating ice cream. They weren't attacking anybody. They weren't beating anybody. They weren't raping anybody. They were watching TV, and they were shotgunned to death. So initially, what happened was the cops, there were some officers that were suspicious of the brothers, but most of them saw them hysterical.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of believed them. They were not arrested right away.
Mm-hmm.
The police were doing their investigation, but the boys, their reaction to the parents being dead, obviously initially they were all upset. The family came, everyone was very upset, worried
Mm-hmm.
about the boys. And here's one of the things that I talk about a lot. Officers, where we can go wrong is a lot of times we think we know how someone should respond to something. Well, they're not acting the right way.
Mm-hmm.
They're not acting. He's not upset enough about
she
his
wouldn't
wife.
do that if
Right. She wouldn't, and that can lead us down the road to making bad investigative assumptions, and it can skew our investigative hypothesis of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see that, now you see this crime scene, you see the boys all upset. It seems like, okay, somebody must have came in and done this. Apparently they shot them 14 times with shotguns at close range. Do you know what that would do to a human body?
Have you seen the crime scene photos?
I've seen the crime scene photos. It blew their heads off. It was
couldn't
horrific.
even, their heads were hanging on by a thread. I'll say that.
Unbelievable. And you say you just wouldn't put that, you wouldn't juxtapose that with the boys. These two young boys are all upset. Their parents are dead.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't think that. Well, how did these boys react to that? Once the furor died down and the investigation is going on, these boys went on a spending spree.
Yeah.
They went out, they bought Rolex watches, they bought a Porsche, they were going out partying. They were not acting the way you would think they should. Now, that's where I want to clarify. When somebody dies in a horrific manner and you see them at the funeral and the other person is laughing or joking, that can be a response to stress. That's not, oh my gosh, how come he's not upset? His wife is dead. He must have killed her. Not necessarily. He can be just responding to stress and acting out that way. Going out on a spending spree and all of a sudden living it up large.
And it wasn't a spending spree of money that they're like, we've had this money, we need to let our hair down. That's newly money they just got through their parents' death that they're spending. Right. I think that's what made it look so bad as well.
And that's exactly right, because now they were rich kids.
Right.
They had everything they needed in life, but then to all of a sudden, my mom's dead, I'm going to buy a Porsche. My mom's dead, I'm buying Rolexes. My mom's dead, I'm going crazy. So people started looking at them. The police did, obviously, as you would. We don't have enough to charge them.
Yeah.
If you listen to the prosecutors, you should watch the documentary. It's actually very good.
Yeah, Netflix.
And they start their investigation, and now they're looking for the weapons. Where are these weapons? So they start checking the area, right? And they go round and round. And in San Diego, which is a little south of Los Angeles, they found a place where the shotguns were sold to the brothers using a stolen ID. I think of Lyle, one of Lyle's friends, took his ID and they went there and bought the shotguns. Now you got these boys buying the shotguns, not necessarily the murder weapons, buying shotguns right before this murder, and the parents are murdered with shotguns. You start to connect it together and they get arrested.
Well, I think what it really brings to the question for me, as someone who probably, I've spent like 30 hours listening to footage, watching the trial, watching the documentary, is the issue of morality in terms of should they be resentenced or should they be remaining basically in prison. And right. I think that's kind of the conversation that's being raised now. That's why we're getting the documentaries. That's why we're getting all these things. So kind of if we're going to look at their scenario, I guess the question it comes down to is people say it wasn't self-defense enough. because there was nothing in the moment threatening them.
Mm-hmm.
However, I'm curious how you feel about built-up abuse and the way that
Right.
someone can snap
Okay.
and what you would consider that.
I think you're good. So I think when we look at the investigative hypothesis and how an investigation goes, first thing you're going to ask is who done it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you want to know why they done it. All right. So that's the things you start to look at because you can certainly use force to protect yourself and kill someone,
Mm-hmm.
and that's justifiable homicide. Officers, you go out there, somebody comes running at you with a knife, you have a right to stop them. You don't have to get stabbed, right? You have a right to use deadly force to stop that, and somebody ends up dead. So in this case, they got the boys arrested. They see them spending the money. There's a jump. Well, they did it for the money. They must have done it for the money, and that's why they're going wild, and we caught them. Well, in the process of the first trial, now you have attorneys involved, and they start to ask the why'd you do it, right? It wasn't a matter if they did it, it was a why'd you do it. That came out pretty early.
Yeah.
They did it because they claimed in the first trial that the father had been sexually abusing them since the time they were young. Now, I remember back then, and
Three, 4 years old.
you heard that story, and you're like, what? It just seemed out of reality. It seems like something a defense attorney would make up. Hey, you know, a woman kills her husband, and the best thing she could say is he was beating me, and I protected myself because we can understand that.
And what's crazy is psychology, how much 30 years has had an exponential. Psychology isn't a linear thing where we're learning more and more. It's once you learn something, it's exponential. So in 30 years, the understanding that society has regarding sexual abuse in general, but sexual abuse towards men and children, familial sexual abuse, has changed so much that I think if we saw that first trial now, for the first time, I think people would react way differently to the brothers and what they had been through than the public scrutiny that they got. For boys don't get sexually abused.
Right. So you told me about this, and I was pretty much locked into my understanding at the time. It's 35 years ago. I don't really think about the Menendez brothers. I heard it on the news. I got the idea. They wanted the money from their parents. They killed them. They made up this whole abuse thing, and it didn't work. The first jury, they came to a hung jury. The jurors couldn't decide. Did they do this for the money? Were they abused? It got all caught up in all of this testimony. Dr. Oziel, the psychiatrist, recorded them. And who did they tell? And then they told a friend. And it got very confusing. And I remember the whole idea, the idea of sexual abuse didn't seem to make sense with what they had done, right? And their example, their statement was, we did it that night while they were sitting on the couch eating ice cream because there had been some kind of a confrontation or something happened, and they thought, this is it. They're going to kill us. Mom and dad are going to come upstairs and kill us tonight. So therefore, we better take them guns, go downstairs, and shoot them while they eat their Rocky Road.
But to me, like, I hear the way you think about it as well. And to me already, I think Eric was supposed to go away to college. He had this light at the end of the tunnel at the place he was in his life where he's thinking, Lyle didn't realize Eric was getting sexually abused for the entire 14 to 17 year span. He thought it was happening to him, and then he went away to college. He didn't realize that the sexual abuse from when they were children was happening to a 16, 17, 18-year-old Eric. Eric's light at the end of the tunnel was that he was going to get to go to college and get away from them so he can stop being sexually abused. His parents then told him he couldn't go away to school and that he would have to stay with them. I think that is also a huge moment where Lyle comes home from college. Him and Eric have a big, powwow about what's going on. And what we saw in the documentary, I'm not sure if they included it, but Kitty and Jose made Lyle wear a hairpiece. And they shaved his head when he was a kid, had his hair removed because he was balding and he had a toupee. This is the inciting incident, is in front of both children. Kitty got mad at Lyle for defending his brother and revealed and ripped out his wig and ripped it out of his scalp. Eric said he never knew his brother wore a hairpiece. And then when they had their powwow, he revealed, this is still happening to me and they're not going to let me leave. So what do we do?
Right. So if we look at it as investigators, we look at it from two different points of view. We can say, one, that's absolute BS. They made up the whole thing. And if we look at that, there are the things in the crime scene speak to that. the innocence of the parents. They weren't coming up the stairs to kill them. They didn't find guns in the couch. They didn't have big Bowie knives. They were going to go upstairs and kill these two boys. There was nothing that appeared imminent that the boys' statement that this is it, they're going to come and kill us now, had any weight.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't see it. I could see if they were coming up the stairs and the boys shotgunned them at the top of the stairs because they both had knives coming to get them. They were eating Rocky Road ice cream, sitting on a couch, and they were cold-bloodedly murdered. Now, I think the point that Marisa, you brought to me, that when I saw the special, and one of the things that came to light is that I'm saying, okay, we didn't think about that kind of sexual abuse back then as much as we do now. We have changed. We have been enlightened to trauma, post-traumatic stress. We've been enlightened to the response of victims to that kind of stress. So now we look at the other side. Let's say it was real. The father was sexually abusing them. Well, from what I saw in that special, it pointed out enough things that I didn't know that I said, I think there was some kind of abuse going on. And the linchpin for me was in the first trial, which of course was deadlocked and was a hung jury. One of their aunts came forward and testified in the trial and said when Eric was 8 years old, an 8-year-old boy, he came forward and told her that he was being sexually abused by his father. Now, I didn't know that from back in 1989. I didn't remember that. All I remember is a swirling thing of sexual abuse, and it didn't seem realistic. But when I saw that, and I said, this woman came forward, and the linchpin is not that the aunt came forward.
It's that
the linchpin is he was 8 years
about
old. He was 8 years old and came forward to say, this is happening to me. That is the moment that I said, the story that there was abuse is probably got some weight to it now.
And also, we have to remember, not only it's bad enough to have, your father sexually assaulting you. I won't get into the specifics, but there was also a very sadist form of assault happening that was just choking them until they got scared they were going to die, rubbing razors on their, private parts. There was just an element of it that wasn't just as flat, incestual type of abuse. It was also it was torture. So they have the phrase, there's no perfect victim. And I always think about that when I think of cases like this, because when you're going through that every day, every night, never know when it's going to end, never know when it's going to start, you may feel like you're always under attack. I don't know.
Right. No, I think that's a reasonable thing to know. Now, we're not psychologists. I've dealt with enough people who have been traumatized and committed crime, traumatized, been victimized, enough people who have been traumatized and committed crime because they were traumatized, to know that there is something to that. There's no doubt about it. Why does a woman, and we'll use a woman as an example, stay in an abusive relationship where she's being beaten, where you, my brothers and sisters, have been to those calls where she's beaten to a pulp? You sign complaints, and then 3 days later, she's taking them back. They're going to work it out. They're going to dismiss the. Why does that happen? Because the woman's stupid? No, not because the woman's stupid, because she's trapped in a cycle of violence. We've learned that that's real. When I came on the job, we didn't have mandatory arrest for showing signs of abuse. It was a family matter. Ma'am, do you want to sign a complaint? No, I don't want to sign. Okay, and you left because it's a family matter. We started to realize, we learned that she can't protect herself. Therefore, the law says if you see a sign of violence, you will make an arrest.
Yeah.
Because we learned over time. We didn't know about this kind of abuse back then, or at least to the detail that we know now. So my point was, when I saw that the aunt had come out and testified that when he was 8 years old, he told her this, that said to me, the violence and the abuse was probably true. Now, to the extent, I don't know, but I think there was abuse. And when you made that point about abusers, we know that in sexual assaults, it's not about the sex. It's about the power you have over another person. When you combine that with attacking children, now you have pedophilia involved.
Yeah.
And attraction to young people and power. The father apparently was a very powerful guy who lorded over everybody. I don't know him. He's in his grave. But this is what we heard. Well, that trial ended in a hung jury, and the prosecutors decided we're going to retry it. It was that heinous of a crime. It's not something you can just say, well, we can't get a conviction. And what happened next in the court system is where I think you might have not necessarily reversible error, and we'll talk about because we have different points of view on that, but certainly in the sentencing. Now, I've talked about this in other programs. We have levels of crime. Somebody ends up dead and somebody's responsible for it. Well, we call that aggravated manslaughter, vehicular homicide. We call it murder. Why do we have all these different names? Somebody's dead and somebody's responsible for it. Because what led to it, what built up to that action where somebody ended up dead, makes a difference to us as a civilized society, as a law-abiding society. We look at that and go, okay, Marisa had too many glasses of wine and had an accident and killed 2 people. Well, her intent was not to kill them, but the mitigating factor, the aggravating factor, was that she was drinking. So her penalty might be 20 years in prison instead of she was just driving down the road, a deer jumped out and she ran over 2 kids. She didn't mean to kill them. It was a happenstance, led to a tragedy, and maybe if she's even charged in that instance, it might be 8 years for simple manslaughter, right? So when we look at homicide, we see that homicides often are designated by different actions that took place.
Yeah.
So if these boys honestly believed that they were about to be attacked, and that's why they did what they did, you could see that the sentencing was wrong. But let's talk about the trial. In the second trial, the prosecutor, Gil Garcetti, I think he was, who had just lost the OJ trial, there's a belief there that he didn't want to lose another high-profile Los Angeles trial. He basically said in the second trial, there'll be no discussion of sexual assault. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about whether these boys killed their parents for our belief that they did it for money. And the jury's going to have one choice: murder one or nothing.
How do you feel about that setup? Is that setting them up for justice?
Looking at it now, going back then, I think everybody looked at it and said, well, they're as guilty as can be. They killed their parents brutally. They were eating ice cream. See how that comes back to what we see? If the parents were coming up the stairs with guns, they would have probably got away with it. The fact that the parents were eating ice cream and the boy said they felt they were going to be killed, they brutally murdered them. That's where we see, I think a lot of people at the time said, these kids are bad.
Yeah.
So whatever we got to do to convict them.
And these people think too, I would never kill my mom and dad. It's brutal. It's horrible. How could they? They're monsters. That's because you're not ever going to have to be, thankfully, in the situation that they were put in, so you can't empathize with that. But with the hindsight that we have now, it seems a little bit like unfair sentencing.
Well, and again, what happens is in all of our endeavors, when we're in the now and we have to look back, we have a tendency to look back with what we know now. And we see that in lots of things. The sins of America are so horrible, but back in the day, that was just how people lived and the things they did. We look at it now with our enlightenment and we say, it was horrific what we did back then, but we can't judge them for what we know. Well, it's the same thing with these trials. So I think in that trial, when they left little choice and you hear the jurors in this they said, we had one choice. Either they murdered them or they did. We didn't hear about any sex assault. We weren't allowed to know about any of that. And they were convicted. And I think everyone was happy that these 2 killer boys who did it for money were sent off to prison for the rest of their life.
Now, if they were, like Leslie Abramson said, if they were Lila and Erica, would we have felt the same way if they were like, our dad was raping us for 20 years and would we feel the same if it was 2 little girls? Would they be the killers they are? We don't believe them? No,
because you know what? Our society, we look at that and we don't see boys being victim of sexual assault, especially back then. Boys and men, you didn't think of that happening. It happened. We heard about it.
But since the beginning of time.
But girls are the ones, females are the ones who were sexually assaulted. And we would have a natural connection to them little girls or young women being assaulted, that they are in the right. This happened to be boys and we didn't believe it. What has happened in the ensuing 35 years is we've learned a lot about PTSD. We've learned a lot about sexual assault. And that aunt, I can't get away from that aunt saying, an 8-year-old boy told her that. At the time, he wasn't looking to get away. He
No.
wasn't looking to buy a Porsche. He was an 8-year-old boy calling for help about being abused. Therefore, I think there was abuse.
And when you're 8, you don't call up a friend, you don't hop on your iPhone. When you see an aunt, when you see an uncle at something, you're like, by the way, something's happened. I don't know who else to tell.
Right.
You know?
Because you can't tell the parents.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are involved in it, right? So now these boys are sitting in there for all these years, and there's interest by young people like Marisa Joy and her friends when this comes up, because they are much more open to social justice concepts and ideas and the way things are portrayed. And I'm not saying that it's portrayed correct or not. I thought the documentary was fair. The prosecutor was on there. The prosecutor had a lot of commentary.
Mm-hmm.
And then it comes up that should these boys get a resentencing based on what we know now compared to back then?
Which, leave us your comments, because this is a very divisive conversation and people tend to fall one way or the other. So I'm curious where your audience is going to fall, your audience of, law enforcement.
Yep. And I think there's two ways to review these kind of things. Emotionally, those two people are dead in their grave. They were killed brutally eating ice cream. They should stay in prison for the rest of their life. They were not under attack when they did this. But like you said, psychologically, could they have felt in that moment? And I'm not one of these wishy-washy, psychological, but I believe there are psychological things that affect people way beyond what we ever knew. And that's, as an investigator, I know that. I bring that to every investigation I've ever done. And you need to do that as well. So this is a good example. Should we take into consideration that these boys were sexually abused, and that led to a confusion and bad decisions on their part that ended up to the deaths of their parents? They absolutely killed their parents.
Mm-hmm.
The argument always is, well, they could have left. They were 18 years old, 19, 20 years old. They could have gotten their Porsche and they could have drove away. They didn't have to kill anybody. They went and bought shotguns in advance of the killing, right? So that's a big thing. If you and I get into a fist fight, an argument, and this and that, and we're fighting, and I choke you to death and kill you, there's no malice aforethought, no premeditation. I go buy a gun to shoot you. I thought about it 3 days in advance. I'm thinking about killing you. So the boys' argument is, no, we got the guns to protect ourselves in case we got attacked, and we thought we were going to get attacked, so we used the guns. They didn't buy the guns to do the murder. That's what they say. So that's really the question. Which do you believe? So I think what's happening now is that a court has finally said that they are willing to look at the sentencing, not the guilt or innocence. Everybody says they did it. Look at the sentencing to see if their 35 years that they've been in prison, has that been enough? Has that been enough? If you're going to give weight to what they said, the reason they did it, which we know now more than we did then, can we say, do we continue to keep them in prison? Or do we look at that in a different light?
One thing I do think, this is something they consider during resentencing things like this, is both of the boys work in the prisons they're in now. Like, they have jobs as peer leaders for people who are adults who are coming to terms with the fact that they were sexually abused when they were children. They're in programs to help other people. They tutor to help them get their GEDs and graduate. Both of them seem to be in situations where they're very involved with, like, making the best out of their life in prison and helping others. Yes. It doesn't seem to me like people who are, monsters.
Right. So interesting is that we do look at that. And I know society and law enforcement, we find that frustrating, because what I always said about someone getting out of prison after they've killed someone, when the victim can crawl out of the grave and go back to their family, then the killers can get out of jail, because the victims never get to crawl out of the grave and go back to their family.
And all I think about this is the perfect version of a survivor we want Lyle and Eric to be is waiting till they were attacked again and then using the gun in that moment. Then they would have been our perfect survivors. They waited. They were the victims for their entire lives. I mean, Kitty and Jose are dead now, so rest in peace, I guess. But at the same time, the victims were their children. They were supposed to not rape and not sexually assault and not choke to death and not play with razors on their kids' private parts. That's what both of them were supposed to do. They're not the victims. In the end, they were victimized as well. But if that's true, if we're going to say it's true, I have a hard time looking at those adults doing that to the 3 and 4-year-old as victims.
You see why I got her on here? Because you know what? Even though it's a different point of view that I had and have
We don't
some
have
for
to
some of it,
agree.
but I think it's a brilliant point. You make a case for that, and that's important. So as investigators, what I'm telling you is you got to look beyond what it looks like. That's the point. We don't know what's going to happen when they get in front of this judge, and the judge is going to say, that's enough. We should have known back then. Now move on and do good things with your life.
I have a question. Is there anything that could have been looked into at the time that you don't think was looked into to further give credence to the fact that they were having some kind of like psychological break or they were going to do this? Were there signs leading to it that other people could have picked up on?
Well, I think the aunt saying the 8-year-old boy said he was molested should have been enough really to move this entire concept further forward.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who has foresight to see that when you see these things? When you hear something in one of your cases, do you see what I'm trying to say here and to teach here? You might come across something that's different than what they did, but it might require you to think beyond just what we know at the time. Is there something going down the road? Is the whole like concept now of trauma-informed responses to everything? Because we're realizing how bad trauma affects people. So I personally, that would have caught my attention now, and I really went to that.
And I remember before you heard that, when you were talking about it, before you had heard that line, you were like, you felt a certain way. And hearing that, you were like, wow, that really
changed my point of view. Now, I wasn't there, I wasn't in the investigation. But when you know all the facts, you have to do the right thing. So I guess the last thing we'll talk about here, because we'll find out soon enough, however this goes. I think Marisa and I come to we're meeting.
A little bit of
we're
a
meeting.
crossroads.
But I think when I look at this, I come down to it and I say, even if you say yes, the father was molesting them, and you can make a case that they were defending themselves or they did whatever and aggravated manslaughter instead of murder for the father. The mother is where I have a problem. The mother who was sitting eating ice cream, and the conversation is that she knew all about it and she allowed it to go on. And I get that. But she didn't actively participate in it, and maybe she was bullied and under the thumb of this brutal man who did this to his children, and he did that to her, and maybe she was traumatized and couldn't come forward, just like the woman that can't leave an abusive relationship. And that's why she didn't come forward. And I say, in that case, killing the mother is where I draw the line.
She was making Eric sleep naked with her, though, in the bed.
Well, I didn't hear that about it.
That was one of the things that came forward in testimony, is he was like, I didn't want to do that, but she would make me cuddle her naked. So I agree. If she doesn't know, if she is a victim herself, it's hard to blame a victim. That's what we're saying. It's hard to blame a victim.
That's why this whole thing is like an onion.
Mm-hmm.
Psychological components to any kind of human interaction is like an onion.
Mm-hmm.
And it can look like a red onion, and then you peel it and it's a yellow onion. You peel it more and it's a green onion. I think for all of us as investigators, we have to take that lesson and look as deep as you can into everything you investigate. That is the lesson of the Menendez brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's teaching us. And to do a good job, to be a good investigator, to serve justice, means to look as deep as you can, have as much understanding as you can, so that you make the right decisions and justice is served.
I agree. I think a lot of the time in modern times, and like what is modern at the time, anyone who came forward, any law enforcement that said, maybe these boys were having this happen, maybe this made them feel, people would have been like, that's woo-woo. That's like woo-woo at the time. Mm-hmm. But having that level of empathy, you always talk about it, it's a person-to-person job. You have the feelings for the woman who won't step forward. You've told me many times, her boyfriend beats her and she won't come forward. So having that empathy and compassion too is something you've always talked about. Sounds like this is a case that we wouldn't have maybe had to retry it if at the time it was handled more like that. I
think that's a great thought. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I hope you get what I'm asking you to do. Marisa Joy, thank you so much for being here on Murder and Mayhem.
Until next time.
Until next time, where I think we might talk about Gabby Petito. and what happened to that young lady, right? Because there's lots of things to talk about. We're also looking into the Gilgo Beach murders, right? I have an office in Long Island, and I'm there all the time. So, all right, we'll see you soon. Remember, like,
Subscribe, ring the
subscribe,
bell.
ring the bell, tell your friends. Let's do this. Have a great day, everyone.